Here at UVU, I've been asked to moderate this session. We're lucky to have to hear from Dr. Lauren Griffin today. She is an assistant professor of philosophy and religious studies at Louisiana State University. She researches and teaches about religion, technology, media, and nationalism. Her first book, Fabricating Founders in Early Modern England, showed how confessional debates played a critical role in the development of national identities. Her current project, which I think we'll hear more about today, investigates contemporary negotiations of national, post-national, religious, and racial identities in Catholic communities online. This project combines insights from science and technology studies, political science, and media studies. She's published in a variety of journals and publications, including Religion Dispatches, the Journal of History and Cultures, Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab, Uncivil Religion, New Conversations About Religion, and Key Categories in the Study of Religion, Context and Critiques, and Encyclopedia of Global Religion. This is an impressive set of journals. And her current project is a volume entitled Discourses of Crisis in the Study of Religion. And today's talk is titled Christian Nationalism in Global Contexts, Examining Traditionalist Catholic Movements.
Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be here. So today I'm here to talk about how the term Christian nationalism gets used by scholars and journalists and observers, and what does that have to do with Catholic communities identified as traditionalist, since the term Christian nationalism, as Dr. Butler emphasized, is most often used to talk about white evangelicals. For those of you who were here for Dr. Butler's presentation, I'm going to sort of unpack some of the stuff because she covered a lot of ground and kind of hit things fast. So I'm going to kind of unpack some stuff that was embedded in what she was saying, a lot about how categories and narratives work to shape identity, who we think we are as individuals and groups. So she brought up categories that don't have clear public definitions, like CRT or parental rights. Like, what do these mean and how are they used? She also talked about how we construct narratives of the American past for our purposes in the present, right? These are some things that I'd like to investigate. So I'll address three main questions today. Again, this definitional question, what is Christian nationalism? I'll talk about this a little bit differently than Dr. Butler did. Is it a particularly American phenomenon? Is it, quote, on the rise? This is the subtitle of a lot of publications on Christian nationalism. Is it driven by evangelical beliefs and practices? So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then kind of the ending question is, what are or should be the cultural resources for national identity, right? If we don't want to invoke particular narratives, what narratives do we want to invoke, right? So first, let's start with this definitional question. Definitions and categories are something that scholars of religion are particularly poised to study simply because of the history and development of our little disciplinary field. What is it exactly that religion scholars study? This is a question we get asked a lot. Why are you here? Do you study spirituality, astrology? Do those count? Atheists? Do those count? Nuns, a new category that's been invented in the last several decades. Do those count? Do those groups, does this group or that group, quote, have a religion? These are all questions at the center of our discipline. One famous scholar of religious studies, J.Z. Smith, famously said that religion, right, is an object of the scholar's study. It's a category that we use to classify certain behaviors, and of course, this definition changes over time and space. So to illustrate this a little bit better in a less boring way, has anybody ever heard the phrase, I'm spiritual but not religious? Yeah, what do you think people mean when they say that? Yeah.
I think it means they have a belief in a higher power, but they don't belong to an organized religion.
Yeah, it's this way of distancing oneself from an organized institution, right? There's a lot bound up in this phrase about individual identity, maybe like a neoliberal self that gets to choose what fits you best, right? But so it's a way of distancing oneself from an institution. So in this construction, religion is the thing we don't want to be, right? Institutional maybe bound up in institutions we see as corrupt, right? I am a free thinker. I'm the decider, right? So there's so religion is the sort of delegitimizing category in that construction. Has anybody ever heard someone say of a particular group, that's actually a cult, not a religion? Yeah? Is that a familiar phrase around these parts? So what do people mean by that? Yeah.
They often use abuse tactics instead of normal, like, hey, you should join.
Yeah, so it's a way of saying this group, the one I'm calling a cult, is abusive or harmful, whereas religions are positive and helpful, right? That's sort of the implication there, if I can read into it a little bit. So in this construction, religion is the good one, the one we want to be. It's the one where nice, positive things happen, and the cult is where the bad stuff happens, right? So in these two different constructions, the operative category of religion is operating very differently, right? In one case, it's delegitimizing, and in one case, it is the legitimate rational point. So all of this is just to say that categories matter, and they change based on context and the users who's using it, right? So we can ask then, what is religion and what is political, and who gets to decide, right? What do we mean by categories as tools that do real social work, right? Depending on the people employing it. I'll go back. There's a book called Taking America Back for God. It's a 2020 book that I think is the key driver of this term's Christian nationalism's recent popularity in our discourse. The authors, Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry, define Christian nationalism as a, quote, ideology that idealizes and advocates the fusion of Christianity and American civic life. So, what do we mean by Christian nationalism, or more broadly, by religious nationalism, right? There are some presuppositions to unpack there. Usually it means that religion and politics are two separate spheres that sometimes interact, right? In other words, it revives the idea that religion is not always and already political, but something else entirely that sometimes interacts with political things, right? Which are by nature supposed to be secular. So for example, just a quick example, my students and I this week in my religion in the US class were reading over the records of the American Lutheran Synod in the years leading up to the Civil War. This was a moment that Dr. Butler mentioned in her talk. So this is just a decade really before a lot of those evangelical denominations, Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterians, split over this issue of enslavement. So at one point in the Lutheran Synod, this speaker is saying that the intermeddling of religious, so he's talking about the black church, which again, as Dr. Butler mentioned, was a place where one of the only institutions, right, the only institution that black folks controlled apart from white oversight, right? So this was the place for meeting for all kinds of things, right? And so this person is saying that the intermeddling of a religious body with the subject of, quote, slavery and slaveholding should not be happening, right? They're being religious, right, and bringing their religion to play on these issues of enslavement and abolition, and that belongs in a separate sphere, right? So we can see how in the 19th century, this category of religion is being used to sort of domesticate a certain type of speech and activity, kind of cordoning it off, right, to keep it in that space, right, for a purpose that we now would not want to do, right? So how do categories work? Is this religion or is it politics, right? So just as this quote cordons off religion to domesticate it, to keep it in a space, we can ask how this functions today, right? In the same way, we can say that Christian nationalism then, and religious nationalism more broadly, are categories that scholars and journalists and observers use to manage difference through these slippery categories of what's public, private, sacred, secular, church, and state. And honestly, it has worked, right? This management of certain types of rhetoric and behavior in a more private space has worked to create ideas of secularism and pluralism that has indeed created the kind of democracy that people want, or at least an imperfect version of something that has kind of worked for a while. So since the usage of the term Christian nationalism has spread since 2020, some Americans have now adopted it as sort of an epithet, right? My political as an epithet, but as Dr. Butler showed, a lot of people are now now adopting it, right, to say, yeah, that is what I think. My political views are inspired by my Christianity, and I like it that way. Now, I am not arguing that Christian nationalism is a bad term or that people shouldn't use it to name and describe their social worlds. It's a fine term that does real work for people. But I'm a scholar of discourse and of religion, so I'm particularly interested in how it's been used and to what social ends. And as many have and will point out today, discourses on religion are very often discourses on race, right? This is something that Dr. Butler highlights when we talk about religious identity and construct religious identity. We're often doing it on ethnic, race, and gendered lines, right? So discourse on race, religion is often discourse on race, and the ideas and communities that are tied to imagined communities based on ethnicity, race, civilization, culture. These are terms that people use to create particular racialized and gendered identities. So that leads to my main job today, to put this in a more global context. So what I want to do first is take a quick look at the history of this term itself. It seems to have emerged pretty recently, right? Really in 2020, but a few years before that. So where did this term come from? That's going to take us to a more global context. So from the night, I looked in JSTOR, a database that contains a bunch of scholarly articles from over time, right? So I looked in this database and I did a search for Christian nationalism or like similar adjacent terms. So the term Christian nationalism from the 1950s to the 1990s was used almost exclusively in a context outside of the US. It was used mostly in the South African context to describe Afrikaner nationalism, Afrikaner being one descended from Dutch settlers and Dutch Calvinism in South Africa. Afrikaner nationalism was an explicitly ethno-nationalist movement or nationalistic political ideology in South Africa. And Christian nationalism became widely used for the first time in American scholarship in the 80s and 90s, most often to refer to the National Party, this Afrikaner nationalist party from 1914 to 1997, which was responsible for apartheid rule and was, of course, explicitly, as you can see, white supremacist. So Christian nationalism in the scholarship of the 80s and 90s referred to the South African context, and a little bit, referred to Lebanon and Hungary, especially, and some other states. After the Lebanese Civil War of 1975, the term was used to describe Lebanese Christian ethno-nationalist movement vis-a-vis kind of Lebanese Muslims and an Arab identity. So studies throughout the 1990s looked at how Christian rhetoric was employed to construct an identity that rejected Arab nationalism and embraced the Phoenician origins of the Lebanese, right? So again, certain folks in Lebanon, right, in order to argue for their own independent idea of nation, are sort of using religion but that overlaps and is entangled with these ethnic identities, right? So discourse on religion is also discourse on race. So after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, the term's also used to describe some of these post-Soviet nationalistic movements in Hungary, the Balkans, and Orthodox Christian articulations in Russia. So in these uses, Christian nationalism describes, in each of these cases, the scholars in the 80s and 90s are using Christian nationalism to describe how different states are using cultural resources of nationalist movements in the 1990s. How are these states, the scholarship asks, using Christian resources to bring about a particular national consciousness or national identity? How do we make people think of themselves as Lebanese, right? And how does Christian resources help us do that, right? And how are they also discourses on race and ethnicity? That's what scholars are talking about. Not a very particular right-wing ideology, which is what it usually means now. So the term is virtually never used to describe U.S. Christians throughout the scholarship of the 20th century. In 1997, so late 20th century, the first time I found this term, it's in a book called The 50s Spiritual Marketplace. And a religious studies professor, Robert Elwood, uses Christian nationalism kind of casually, just drops it in his conclusion, to refer to the pervasiveness of an uncritical Cold War nationalism that's infused with like religious myths and symbols. Oops. Oh no. There we go. So in other words, many liberals and conservatives in the 1930s through the 60s had already operated under the assumption that the church should influence politics and that the political order would be, in some sense, Christian, because most politicians are Christian, and that's sort of the case, right? So it's this sort of like sanitizing of this fact. In the early years of the Cold War, both liberal and conservative politicians articulated their political programs using Christian rhetoric. Historical work from the 80s and 90s recognized this, and of course used other categories like the normalizing civil religion, right, to casually refer to this historical fact. Of course, there are cultural resources for nationalism, and in the U.S., it makes sense that they're Christian. This is mere civil religious patriotism, right? Something that we would now scandalously call Christian nationalism. In the year 2000, two journalists wrote a book called Right-Wing Populism in America, in which they trace right-wing populism throughout American history to the present. And this is the earliest instance that I found of Christian nationalism being used consistently throughout the book to name a particular movement, right? And in that book, it's contrasted with dominion theology as the pragmatic options for Christians who want to influence public policy without proposing a theocracy, right? So the dominion theology was the theocratic one. Christian nationalists were the more pragmatic ones who want to use their Christianity to influence public policy. The real turning point for the term, though, comes in 2006 when a journalist named Michelle Goldberg, she's a New York Times bestseller, wrote a book called Kingdom Coming: The Rise of Christian Nationalism. This is where the term starts to become legible in sort of the scholarship of U.S., of at least scholars in the U.S. She writes that the movement called Christian nationalism is, quote, qualitatively different than other religious movements. She says, quote, like America's past great awakenings, the Christian nationalist movement claims that the Bible is absolutely and literally true, but it goes much further, extrapolating a total political program for that truth and yoking that program to a political party. It is a conflation of scripture and politics that sees America's triumphs as confirmations of the truth of the Christian religion. So in addition to drawing on those two previous journalists from the year 2000, Goldberg finds the roots of Christian nationalism for her in the 1940s and 50s with a guy named Gerald L.K. Smith and his explicitly anti-Semitic organization called the Christian Nationalist Crusade. So that's kind of where she was drawing this term in particular. She then traces that movement through the John Birch Society in the 1960s and the religious right in the 1970s. So Goldberg sees Christian nationalism as fundamentally a reaction to modernity, right? So Goldberg's book, again, she's a journalist, Goldberg's book is reviewed in academic journals, and scholars quickly start to pick up this term and use it in the same way she did. So a quite different way from the way we were using it globally. Now we're using it to refer to a very particular right-wing movement. So it's used a little bit throughout the 2010s, and in the wake of 9/11 and the close of the Bush era and the beginning of the Obama era, Christian nationalism is no longer civil religion, right, or a way to articulate how the cultural resources of nationalism are often Christian, but rather a unique and identifiable belief system or ideology. So the category has shifted to mean a very particular belief system, which is anchored by understandings of the past for uses in the present, right? It had moved from a term to identify them, that is other nations, South Africa, Lebanon, Hungary, to the US, and this new thing that has now made our previously secular, our previously secular wonderfully, democratic shores, Christian nationalism has now come. So books tracing the history and mapping the origins of Christian nationalism begin to appear, finding it in places from the corporate New Deal reactionaries of the 1940s, that's one of them, to the early 19th century evangelicals trying to sacralize the legacy of George Washington. Others found the roots of Christian nationalism, quote, in the 1970s. There was a reaction to the civil rights movement, and others see it as a fusion of, quote, racism, apocalypticism, and nationalism as early as the 17th century, and still others point back to Puritan millennialism, and still others point further back to the 16th century doctrine of discovery. And if the doctrine of discovery isn't old enough, my own first book looked at the emergence of national consciousness in 16th century England and argued that national consciousness, people thinking themselves as distinctly English, right, emerges because they had to articulate England in distinctly confessional terms, right? So because Catholics and Protestants are fighting, they have to articulate England using narratives of origin and election, right? We saw the clip in Professor Butler's talk about the city on a hill. The U.S. is not the first nation to see itself as uniquely elect, right? So narratives of origin and election, special mission, myths of a golden age when it was great, and then narratives of persecution and sacrifice. These are still things we see in a variety of articulations of national identity today. So my own first book, I don't use the term Christian nationalism in the book, but it traces why the articulation of nationalism had to be in Christian terms, which then, of course, impacted the way the U.S. Articulated itself as well. So these are all good books, right? I'm not meaning to suggest otherwise. I find them helpful. Indeed, they show us that the cultural resources of conquest, colonialism, imperialism, and 20th century nationalism in the U.S. have quite always been Christian. So we may ask then, how is Christian nationalism a helpful framework for examining our current political moment? Why did the term go wild in 2020, and why is it depicted as on the rise when claims that the U.S. is a Christian nation on survey data is the lowest it's ever been in U.S. history? So growing scholarly usage, the category Christian nationalism really found its salience through two events. The election of Donald Trump and the events at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. Since Christian rhetoric, images, and symbols were deployed by some at these events, the need to organize this data and make sense of these moments, Christian nationalism became a helpful framework through which to do that. Again, a fine one, but we're thinking about how it's working, right? So the timely release of Whitehead and Perry's Taking America Back for God book just weeks after this event has made it kind of the touchstone for scholars and journalists on work on Christian nationalism, right? They always go back to Whitehead and Perry's book, which is where this term really starts becoming legible in our current political moment. So this is the chart, this is the data that Whitehead and Perry used. This data comes from 2007 and 2017 Baylor Religion Survey. So this is how they sort of measure Christian nationalism. So after taking a quick look at this list, would you agree with the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation? It should advocate Christian values. It should enforce a strict separation of church and state. That was the one they said no, that's the kind of an outlier. The federal government should allow the display of religious symbols in public spaces. The success of the United States is part of God's plan. The federal government should allow prayer in public schools. So after looking at this list, what do you notice about some of these statements? What strikes you?
They don't define what counts as a religion and what doesn't. It leaves it up to the person answering the question.
Yeah. What religions are we talking about? Whose prayers are we talking about? What else do we notice?
I feel like the third one almost is counterintuitive to some of the other ones.
Yeah, so that's kind of the one that when they're measuring these, they're saying who agrees with these, except for that one, it's like a disagree is the higher measure of Christian nationalism. So that one is a little bit weird. What else do we notice about the list? There's one up here.
Some are dealing with the establishment clause and some are dealing with the prohibition clause. So, the federal government should allow prayer in public schools. It's one thing to allow people their religious liberty. It's another thing to have the school require or have an official prayer. And that's very confusing because of that question.
Yeah, so a lot of these aren't exactly clear cut, right, when we see them. We'll do one more. I see a hand back here. We'll do this last one.
I noticed the first two are focused on Christianity, and then all the others are a lot less specific.
Yeah, exactly. So less specific. What Christianity? What Christian values? Christian values like, be kind to your neighbor, because I'm good with that, right? So you can imagine that some people would say yes to a lot of these questions, right? Depending on how you're interpreting them, how you think the categories are functioning. So all but number one seem a little bit flexible, right? So this is where they get their data. And again, other research data shows us that this idea that the United States should be declared a Christian nation, whatever that means, that statement is the lowest it's ever been, right? Surveys from the 90s and the early 2000s have higher rates of people saying that. The 2017 is the lowest of people saying, I fully agree and support that statement, right? So it's actually less strong. Now, this is all not to say that this data is not good or that it's worthless or anything like that. It's just saying that what this is doing, right, is that Christian nationalism brings together a wide variety of material and sort of manages acceptable uses of religious narratives, symbols, and images in public discourse, right? That's all we're saying. How does the rhetoric of religion manage what can be an inspiration for public policy and what cannot? This is the speech that Professor Butler mentioned that happened just within the last month, where Trump is sort of laying out his 2025 plan. And as you can see in some of these are, if we take Christian nationalism to mean that Christians should be in charge of the nation and that the nation should reflect whoever's interpretation of Christianity, we can see that a lot of these could be kind of easily separated, right? We've got ideas like launch the largest domestic deportation operation in American history. We have school vouchers. We have a universal school choice. We have install conservative justices like Scalia and Thomas. Obviously, Scalia and Thomas were appointed long ago, right? Before this term Christian nationalism comes up. So this is not to say that these are not inspired by some people's Christian identities or interpretation of, or their Christian vision or their interpretation of Christianity. I am certain that the cultural resources for some of these indeed are inspired by those things. Now, I have my own feelings on these political issues, right? And I also marshal cultural resources to justify them, to make sense of them to myself, right? I do the same thing, even though it looks quite different from this plan. So that leads us to ask, right? Wanting conservative judges, is that Christian nationalism? Wanting school choice, is that Christian nationalism? Again, I understand why it's inspired by certain ideas about religion, which is also discourses on race, right? I understand that. But it does lead us to ask, is this all Christian nationalism, right? So that just leads us to say, how does Christian nationalism bring together a wide variety of material, and how does it help us manage the acceptable uses of religions, narratives, and symbols in political discourse, right? I'm going to skip down. So some may quibble about calling it Christian nationalism or argue that the mediatized version is a catch-all term and not real Christian nationalism, but a brief overview of the term that I've given has shown that the term actually came from a global political context and was only made popular to describe the US context by journalists in the 21st century, right? It was only recently adopted as a paradigmatic concept for an explanation for right-wing activity in the US, and now it's often talked about as being exported to other places, right? So in order to talk about how Christian nationalism is discussed around the globe, how do people imagine the U.S. to be exporting this ideology, right? I want to focus on one particular subset of those subsumed under the category of Christian nationalism, and that is the traditionalist Catholics, or the trads, #trads if you're an online girly like me. So I like the trads example because, number one, it challenges this notion that Christian nationalism is caused by evangelicalism or is uniquely due to evangelical beliefs and practices. And two, it challenges this notion that it is a particularly American phenomenon. And three, the diversity of resources challenges the idea that trads are a coherent and definable group. Just like the term Christian nationalism, just like the term DEI, parental rights, just like all of these terms that we've been kind of examining today, trads are a group that are used by observers, scholars, journalists, and others to make sense of something that is really incoherent, right? So first, what are trads? Trads are often defined as Catholics who prefer the liturgy and social teaching from before the Second Vatican Council, which is a big meeting of bishops in the 1960s, where some see the church modernizing, right? So some associate trads with an affinity for old things, tradition, the Latin Mass, Gregorian chant, rosaries, Baroque aesthetics, a dark academia vibe, right? So there's this. Some argue that it's mostly an online trend, while others point to the visible traditionalist or Latin Mass communities on the ground. While those who desire that pre-Vatican II church, right, these people who are traditionalists have existed since Vatican II, obviously, right? And those desiring traditional reform existed even before that, right? So the imagined online or contemporary trad identity is really a production of the internet, right? Indeed, Web 2.0, social media, and algorithmic culture. Trad is as much a product of internet culture, mediatization, and late capitalism as it is of any Catholic tradition, right? And my own research shows that those labeled trad vary on politics, liturgy, doctrine, social teaching. There's a huge variety of them. So we can ask, is this really about Vatican II, or are rad trads just an angry, social media mob? Is it a political movement, right? Or is it religious? Do we include lefty trads, tradanistas, and right-wing church militants in the same category? Some people use rad trad and trad to wrap a variety of social phenomena into a neat package, while for others it functions to separate religion and treat it as an independent variable itself. Again, a lot of discourse is Catholic tradition makes these people be right-wing, right? That influences their behavior, right? Because it's this idea of going back. So I argue, though, that it is precisely the flexibility, not the rigid orthodoxy of ideas of tradition, that render it a very influential tool on the sort of social media moment. So given that trads aren't a coherent group or movement, but rather a media image, we can ask, what does the idea of trad look like outside of the US media bubble? What does it look like in non-English media? How do other nations use Christian resources to define nationalism? So first up, Brazil. I'll do 3 examples real quick. Brazil, about a year ago in January, thousands of supporters and former Brazilian President Bolsonaro stormed the Brazilian Congress. So a lot of people are comparing this to the U.S. Capitol insurrection, and they're saying, oh, U.S. evangelicals have exported Christian nationalism, and now Brazilian evangelicals are doing the same thing with Bolsonaro, so it's the same, right? However, traditionalist Catholicism has a really a long history in Brazil itself, right? From Brazil's independence in 1822 on, the cultural resources for Brazilian national identity have always been Christian, indeed Catholic. In the 1990s, it is true, evangelical churches, mostly the Pentecostal Assembly of God churches, grew rapidly, but Catholics held on, especially charismatic and traditionalist Catholics began to grow. We have liberation theology going on in Brazil in the 70s and beyond. So we have sort of a left-wing contingent. We have a right-wing contingent. Brazilian trad Twitter is just as active as U.S. trad Twitter, sometimes even rejecting the U.S. as sort of a capitalistic, McDonald's-ified, hyper-nationalist space. So they have their own idea about trad wives and trad culture, and it's its own thing. Now, of course, it overlaps with U.S. discourse, and there's talking about it, right? It's a layered story of circulation and exchange, right? Because of the internet. But it's not a simple story of, oh, the U.S. exported its evangelical Christian nationalism to Brazil, right? Brazil, if you want to be right-wing, if you want to be authoritarian, Brazil has plenty of its own resources, and Catholicism provides all of those resources as well. It doesn't have to be evangelical, and it does not have to be American. There are also international networks, right? Steve Bannon and Avalo de Carvalho, both advisors to their respective leaders at one point, are both traditionalist Catholics. They kept in contact. So rather than view the roots of Brazil's Bolsonaro moment and the trad Caths and supported for sort of the same view, right, that it's basically Trumpism, we can highlight its history and local context while also recognizing the international networks and internet culture that go into it. There are no easy answers. It's not a clear-cut story, right? Similarly in India, right? In India, Hindu native rhetoric began long ago to provide a basis for questioning British colonialism, and it provided cultural resources for Indian nationalists. Now, trads, the traditionalist Catholics in India, there's a solid number of them. And for them, right, confronting a Hindu nationalist rhetoric, their bishops urge voters to keep the country secular. So trads here, rather than being hyper-nationalists, are actually quite the opposite. Context matters, right? And finally, people say that Hindu nationalism is actually about culture, not religion. Here we see categories at work again. What is religion and what is culture? So people will say, well, Modi means Hindu just meaning culturally, right? And sometimes ethnically, right? He doesn't mean that you can't be Christian and have Christmas, right? So we have these debates. And then trads in Germany. Trads in Germany, often the trad discourse on German Catholic Twitter is often using Catholic tradition, ideas of Catholic tradition to construct identities about Western civilization and Western culture vis-a-vis migration and changing norms around gender and sexuality, right? So for this, it really is creating a broader Western civilization rather than so much a sort of unique German identity. We can see this with non-Christian resources for white nationalism, right? People use ideas of ancient Greece and ancient Rome to do the same thing, right? So you don't need religion to do this. You don't need things we call religion to do this. You don't need Christianity to do this. You don't need evangelicalism to do this. People find the cultural resources to communicate particular national identities. So in conclusion, what can trads around the world show us? That marshaling Christian resources for national identity is not unique to the US. It's not unique to modern times or evangelicals. And more broadly, religious nationalism is not unique to Christianity, our contemporary moment, nor even religion. There are lots of cultural resources for national identity that are also racialized and gendered, and Roman civilization is just but one example, right? Many scholars on Christian nationalism are highlighting how discourses on Christian identity are often thinly veiled discourses on race, particularly white supremacy. And that's great. These are important conversations. Dr. Butler did a great job at doing this. But we may also ask how this separate term and framework conceals how the cultural resources of white supremacy and patriarchy have always involved Christian narratives and symbols. And on the flip side, how might it conceal how the ways that narratives, myths, and symbols that we would not call Christian, ancient Greece and Rome, other symbols from secular spaces, have also been used to undergird supremacist and patriarchal claims, right? In other words, how might Christian nationalism, even if conceived of as a broader cultural toolkit, direct our attention to the belief system or ideology itself, instead of asking different questions about the endurance of certain systems of power, regardless of their particular cultural resources? The scholarship of religious studies shows that perhaps it's more fruitful to analyze function rather than trying to articulate some essential components of a coherent movement. So here are just some images from January 6th showing that maybe it's not so coherent, right? Nationalism, by definition, defines boundaries of who's in and who's out. There are a variety of cultural resources for national identity, but the process of identification involves negotiation of narratives surrounding who we are, were, and should be. What do we marshal to do that, and how is it raced and gendered? Thank you so much for listening today.
Thank you, Lauren. We have 10 minutes for questions. If you'll wait for the microphone, that would be great so that we can capture it on the live stream.
Now, on the one hand, thinking in the U.S. that what's now called a Christian nationalism could be seen as just a continuation, right, of what we, what I remember, growing up in the 90s, and many of us remember under the Bush administration as the moral majority, right? But it seems like the term, it's being labeled with the term Christian nationalism, as you say, more recently. And I think what your talk is highlighting is that what seems to be the dog wagging the tail is nationalism. And that what we see globally is the rise of nationalism, which here we've seen a greater legitimacy for nationalist policies like military isolationism, economic protectionism, right? Anti-immigration stances that are grounded in rhetorics of preserving national character. And this brings with it the promotion of very essentialized representations of the national character, of national identity, who kind of we are, whatever wherever that deictic is located. So it seems like, you know, that there are things that, for kind of defining the we, language, ethnicity, cuisine, that religion is one of those things that are kind of ready to hand for defining that national character. Is that most of what are you saying that that's most of what we see going on, is that it's really about the rise of nationalism and the using of various emblems of national identity and kind of using those to essentialize the we in order to justify policies of kind of strong boundaries that are required for nationalism? Is that primarily what you see going on here, or is there something about, do you see in a way the use of these symbols in some instances causing religious logics and narratives to kind of push back and actually redefine the nature of particular nationalisms as they are negotiated?
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely see religious and other cultural resources, right, as useful tools in the cultural toolbox, right, to construct those identities. So nationalism always has an idea of a golden age, a chosenness, an election, narratives of persecution, right? These are really helpful for solidifying, boundaries and who we are, who's in and who's out. So religious resources are marshaled, like other cultural resources, are marshaled to do that. I think that this idea that like looking into the past of that, like what's interesting to me about the term Christian nationalism is that we used to call that other stuff, like civil religion, right? We used to say, yes, this is how this works. People marshal religious resources for these things. And this shift to Christian nationalism, I think, shows a shift on behalf of scholars, journalists, and the general public, that something that used to be sanitized is now scandalized, because people are drawing out more clearly these connections of how discourses on religion are really discourses on race and gender, right? Which is an important point, but an interesting one to point out. Now, the second half of your question I was thinking about, are we seeing a shift in how this is happening? I think media is key. I think the internet is like the determinative factor in all of this and why we see this shift. And so in some of the stuff I've looked at here with Germany and in the trads, in online trad stuff, it's really not the nation that is the primary point of departure. It's about constructing a broader coalition of white Western civilization, right, as the pinnacle of stuff, reclaiming Western civilization. So there really is an idea of an America and Europe that has the pinnacle of civilization that we need to bring back or something. So for Germans and for a lot of US trads, Brazilian trads, the nation is important because that's where laws happen, right? Like for all of us, the nation is important because that's what we're living in, a nationalist paradigm. But I do see this merge toward a post-nationalist identity that's a broader idea of like white Western civilization. That's interesting.
Lauren, I appreciate you highlighting the diversity among all the different Christian nationalist visions. I'm wondering if that diversity ever causes tensions within these different groups. That, like, a lot of these Protestants don't envision Catholics as part of their Christian nationalism. Catholics might be aware of that or not. Did that ever lead to infighting between these different groups, or are they always focused on their target secular group and they're not focused on the diversity?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, of course, infighting abounds, right? So when it works, like people can draw useful affinities, and then in other contexts to draw boundaries, right? And this is certainly no different. Yeah. So sometimes I remember like Eric Metaxas and some Catholics organized a march a few years ago. They were quite happy to collaborate across sort of denominational lines, but at other times there's certainly infighting, even within Catholicism, even within trads. So like even within these sub communities, there's infighting about who's got it right, who's the most authentic. So authenticity debates throughout all of this at all the levels are very much part of it, right? So yeah, collaboration can happen if needs be, but boundaries can be drawn real quick. Absolutely.
Is Mormon ideology, like how does Mormon ideology exactly fit into the Christian nationalist movement?
Yeah, so I think we'll have a talk on that specifically later today, but from what I'm seeing here, so for example, on trad Catholic Twitter, it'll overlap with like DesNat, what is called like discourse, right? And sometimes we'll see collaboration there. But other times it's like, Catholics aren't real Christians, Mormons aren't real Christians, right? We have, again, the authenticity policing. So there certainly is a Mormon voice in this. And in the tradwife movement as well, more not really movement, in tradwife content, especially on TikTok, it was it's interesting because Mormons so dominated like the mommy blogs of Web 1, and then now that TikTok has sort of changed some of that discourse, there's still a very Mormon voice, but it got to be Catholic and Orthodox because we're searching for an older tradition, right? That's this Western civilization, so it got kind of more dominated by that type of content. But yeah, certainly DesNat and hashtag RadTrad talk on Twitter all the time.
Wait, this is a quick question.
Okay.
Do the trads have leaders? I'm thinking that, and I might be confused, there was a bishop in Tyler, Texas that just got the boot. Was that a white nationalist or a Christian nationalist?
So it depends on who you ask, because categories are the tool of the person. But yeah, so what was it again? Our trads. Led by. So there's a lot of bishops that are stars in the trad world. Certainly, some engage more carefully, some engage more directly. Like there's a guy Athanasius Snyder who's explicitly kind of part of this, and an anti-Francis type of guy. Some of them are a little bit more on the outskirts. Some trads think some bishops aren't trad enough, and some things they're too whatever. So it depends on who you ask. It's not a coherent thing, right? So yes, I am certain though that there are definitely bishops and just really lay leaders. Taylor Marshall is one for like the millennials, elder millennials, I would say, and younger ones like Nick Fuentes of America First, who's a younger guy. They're all part of what most people would call a trad, but not all trads like those figures. Some say they're too white nationalists, and I just want to watch a Latin mass, not donate to Trump. That's a quote from a tweet. So again, they vary across the political spectrum and debate amongst themselves on who's in and who's out. Yeah.
So, oh, it is on. Okay. So, as a old school leftist, I think of nationalism as potentially two different things. There's nationalism which is dominating nationalism, which is nostalgic and goes back to wants to go back to a past that maybe never really existed. This is the bad nationalism, and it seems like to me that in this conversation so far, we've mostly focused on that. But I also think that there are good nationalisms because there's asymmetries in power with nations, right? And so, like, for example, in the United States, black nationalism, the Black Panthers, that seems to me to be a liberatory movement. And there are other nationalist movements, for example, the Vietnamese revolutionary movement that kicked the U.S. out, and which used nationalism as ways of liberating. So I guess my question is, does that asymmetry between good nationalism in power and, bad nationalism in power and good nationalism, which is liberatory. Does that play out at all in these discussions?
Yeah, absolutely, I think. So to go back to the way that the Black church in the 19th century is using the Black church as a source of their own national identity and their vision of the nation that was backed by, the Black church tradition, right? So what's interesting about Christian nationalism and the way it's deployed is we can see how people police good nationalism and bad nationalism through terms like Christian nationalism. That's what it's good for. It's good for demarcating what we think is good and what we think is bad.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Griffin.
Thank you.